All right, guys, bear with me. This is my longest presentation here to date. And this is something I spent quite a bit of time. I actually started working on researching this case really kind of several months ago when the Arrow report came out, and even a little bit before that. But been working on it pretty much every day for the last few weeks, digging through the original source material to kind of figure this case out. And so it's going to be long. I'll try and get through it as quick as I can. And so today we're going to be telling the story of the Alvin Moore fragment, which he would later call the Virginia skystone, and how it essentially got turned into this story that Wilbert Smith would tell of a piece of debris being shot off a UFO in July 1952. And all of this takes place during the summer of 1952. The summer of 1952 is perhaps most famous in ufology for a flap of sightings around the nation's capital in the last half of July. This event, sometimes called the Washington Merry-Go-Round or Washington National Sightings, involved multiple targets picked up on air traffic control radars around Washington, D.C. These radar targets were watched for several hours by air traffic controllers over the night of July 19th and into the early morning of July 20th. Several Capital Airline pilots reported seeing these objects visually as white or glowing orange lights in the restricted airspace over the White House and the Capitol. By the time two F-94 interceptors arrive from Delaware at 3 a.m., the objects are nowhere to be found. The jets depart, and the UFOs are seen to return by another Capital Airlines pilot. Unknown radar targets continue to appear into the evening of the 20th, and this will eventually culminate in news articles about a 24-hour shoot-down order issued on July 28th and General Sanford's famous press conference on July 29th. I will point out this shoot-down order, while it was printed in the press on July 28th, was a bit of a myth and kind of a misunderstanding. There apparently was no actual shoot-down order. It was really just kind of secondhand information that got published in the paper. No shoot-down order would have actually been necessary due to the rules of engagement in the area. They wouldn't have actually needed a specific shoot-down order. So that's a bit of a myth. The shoot-down order did not happen, but it was widely publicized in the papers at the time. And again, there was the famous General Sanford's press conference on July 29th. But hidden amongst these relatively mundane cases of radar blips and white lights was a more sensational case involving an alleged metal debris sample from a UFO found on a farm in Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. This is the case many people may have heard in some form before, but they likely have not heard the true story. For the story frequently told, as this is the case in ufology, is so distorted that the original characters have been completely removed and an entirely, mostly new narrative has been created. This false story started to propagate in the UFO literature in the 1960s, thanks with the help of a few infamous UFO figures. And this is the story of the Alvin Moore UFO fragment and how it got turned into the Wilbert Smith shoot-down story. Now, just a little background information on Alvin Moore. Commander Alvin Moore was a very interesting character. He had quite an impressive background. That would seem to make him one of the more reliable and credible kind of like witnesses and people to talk about this topic, you would think. Educated at the U.S. Naval Academy, the American University, George Washington School of Law, University of Florida, and Louisiana State, he held bachelor's and master's degrees. He apparently was just shy of a PhD, but was too busy working for the government to finish that. He specialized in aeronautical engineering, and he was a patent engineer and attorney for Werner Van Braun's team at Huntsville, Alabama. He briefly worked as a Border Patrol agent in the newly formed Border Patrol in the mid-1920s along the Arizona-Mexico border, and he wrote a book called Border Patrol about his experiences there. He was briefly the vice consul for, I believe, Mexico for a while, and was a career intelligence officer with the OSI and the CIA for a large part of his career. In addition to being a patent examiner specializing in aeronautics and propulsion patents, he also supposedly held over 50 of his own patents. I wasn't able to find 50, but I found several. And part of it might be because they're under different names, like they're under Alvin Moore or A.E. Moore. And so they don't all show up in the same listing. But he had quite a few patents, including for 2 for an airship design. But so the background is this guy is a seemingly intelligent guy, lots of education, lots of engineering knowledge, that was a career intelligence officer with the CIA and the Navy. And he basically kept a diary that would be printed in the form of this book, The Mystery of the Skymen, later on. And that diary was also reprinted by Timothy Beckley in 1997 under a different title, The Secret UFO Diary of CIA Operative Commander Alvin Moore. He actually had also written a book in 1952 called The World Republic, which he kind of advocates for a world federation or kind of like a world government. And so he's quite an interesting guy. He's written on quite a few different kind of topics there. But to get to our main story, on July 23rd, 1952, 69-year-old Robert L. Lanham and his 14-year-old grandson, Bitsy, Robert Wilson Lanham Jr., were walking through the woods near Alvin Moore's Pine Moor Estate, 20 miles outside of Washington, D.C., in Vienna, Virginia. And I'll point out, I spent some time trying to figure out kind of exactly where these estates were, and I had a little difficulty because the streets names don't really exist anymore. His address was kind of just Pine Moor on Route 1 in Vienna, Virginia. Only there's never been a Route 1 in Vienna, Virginia, unless he means Route 7. And census data would imply he did actually live on Route 7. But anyways, I spent some time trying to find exactly where, but really all that's important to know is that it was kind of in the woods, kind of outside of Vienna, Virginia there. And so they were walking kind of in these woods near Alvin Moore's estate. Most of the literature reports this happened on Alvin Moore's estate. That's where they found this thing. That's actually not true. Some of the literature then says actually it was on these Lanham people's estate. That's actually not true either. It was on an unknown neighbor's estate. So we don't exactly know where it happened. But they're out walking in these woods looking for a baby fox of a mother who had recently been killed in the area. And they kind of stopped to take a break about 50 feet from a groundhog's den. And they paused to rest and watch to see if they can see this groundhog come out. Suddenly, his grandson Bitsy says, "Granddaddy, isn't that a funny looking stone?" And Mr. Lanham watches as Bitsy goes and he picks up this stone laying on a bed of pine needles. It's not embedded in the ground or in a hole, as is frequently reported elsewhere. In fact, some of the literature says it was found in a hole reeking of a sulfurous smell. I just had to get sulfur in there for you guys. But no, that's not actually the case. It was just found on a bed of pine needles. None of the literature actually even says it was warm or still hot to the touch. They just said that it had a burnt smell to it. But it was just laying on these bed of pine needles. He felt it was no ordinary stone, though. It was too heavy for its size, and it had this kind of burned odor. And these photos, they're not the best photos, but they're the only photos we have kind of of this object, and they were taken by the National Bureau of Standards when they analyzed this object. According to Moore's notes on the back of them, supposedly before they tested or cut the object up. So they're all we have to go on, and they're not that legible. You can't really see them all that well, but it give you an idea of a stone, the stone that they found anyways. Now, 2 days later, on July 25th at 4 p.m., Mr. Lanham was receiving a ride home from his neighbor and boss for the last 4 or 5 years, Commander Alvin Moore. So Mr. Lanham basically kind of was like a caretaker and did work around his property for the last, several years. And Moore would end up giving him and sometimes his grandson like a ride home from his property back like to their place or to the grandson's house. And at this occasion, he was doing that. He was giving Mr. Lanham a ride home with another guy. And Mr. Lanham decided to tell Moore about this curious stone and offered to show him this stone sample that his grandson had found out in the woods. He thought it might be a meteorite at first and perhaps wanted opinion on this curious stone he found. Moore tells Lanham about these newspaper accounts of these flying saucers because this is just days after, the Washington flap happened on the 19th and 20th. And But Moore, Lanham basically had not followed the stories. He hadn't really heard of them, and he didn't really seem interested in these flying saucer stories at all. But Moore was fascinated because realizing that this object was found underneath the path between Washington, D.C. and Herndon, Virginia, which is basically where Dulles International Airport is now, is where this object was found. And it's where these radar operators and veteran pilots supposedly saw these flying saucers, or glowing objects, as they'll be reported. And so he became very interested in this object, thinking there might be a relation there. So examining the object closely, you can no longer smell the burnt smell that was present when the object was first found, but it had been 2 days since then it was found. And Moore obtains Lanham's permission to have the stone examined by the government. And at this point, Moore works as the chief of the Technical Information Branch at the Bureau of Aeronautics. And the Bureau of Aeronautics, I was a bit confused at first until I looked it up. It doesn't have anything to do with like NASA or an early NASA. The Bureau of Aeronautics was the U.S. Navy's material support organization. They were for naval aviation from 1921 through 1959. They had the responsibility for the design, procurement, and support of naval aircraft and related systems. And he was the chief of the Technical Information Branch there. And he wanted to send this object off for analysis, but he didn't kind of want to go off half-cocked without having done some preliminary investigation of his own to see what he could kind of figure out. And so on July 29th, after periodically studying the stone over the preceding weekend, he logged the following kind of description in his journal. It obviously had been at some point fractured on 2 of its surfaces. The edges of the fractures are very sharp and in places come to this sharp points. One very small part of the fractures looked as though it was done recently. The stone is bluish gray in color, and I believe it is several times heavier than the same volume of an ordinary stone. Its longest dimension is about 4 inches. On the surface of it, it is cylindrical, with the chord of the arc of the cylindrical surface being slightly over 3 inches, and with a distance of 2 5/8 inches between the arc. The cylindrical surface obviously has been intelligently shaped, either by casting or tooling. I believe tooling. There are fragmented coatings of a cement-like substance on the cylindrical surface. The largest of the fractured surfaces has yellowish or brown stains, mostly located along the sharp edges of the fractures. These stains look like stains from a very hot flame. Also on this surface, as well as on parts of the other 2 fractured surfaces, there are embedded in the stone-like material a large number of little balls of sizes varying from 1/8 of an inch in diameter to pinpoint size. Note, by the time of this letter that was sent to Ruppelt on August 8th, the stains were not very prominent anymore. And later in that evening, Moore accompanied Lanham to the area of the woods where this object had been found to examine the wood. And they examined this wooded area for about an hour and a half, looking for any kind of smashed trees or an additional evidence that would support that this object kind of was coming from the air. But besides for a small kind of brush between where the object was found, that may have been exposed to heat, but it may have just died from the drought that I guess was taking place, they didn't really find anything of interest at that time. On July 30th, Moore finally decides to take this stony object to the U.S. Bureau of Standards and shows it to 5 scientists who all indicate, after briefly examining the object, they could not identify it. Most felt it was not a natural stone. Mr. H. Hockman of the Bureau Stone Section, Mineral Products Division, weighed the stone and determined it had a dry weight of 532.91 grams, or roughly 1.2 pounds, and that its specific gravity was 3.48. Far outside the range of the specific gravity of common stones, which according to a book they referenced only had a range of 2.2 to 2.8. Now, Hockman and Moore, they then measured the radius of that cylindrical surface as approximately 5.2 inches. And they extrapolate from that if the object had come from a cylinder, it would have had a radius of roughly 10.4 inches. Elsewhere, I believe he's kind of says close to 2 feet, and later on, other people kind of will describe, say, close to 2 feet for this sample. Now, one of the people he showed it to is Dr. John McBurney, also the Mineral Products Division. He examined many meteorites, in his life, and had stated that it was not a meteorite. The object was eventually turned over to Mr. H.F. McMurdy, chief of the Constitution and Microstructure section, for further analysis. And it is suggested by Moore that they don't tell any of the assistants where the object came from so as to not bias the results. And this is actually important to remember because many people later on people will make an issue of the fact that the analysts weren't told where it came from, and how could they possibly analyze it if they weren't told where it came from. But the fact of the matter is they were suggested by Moore himself to not say where the object came from. And frankly, you don't need to know where the object came from to perform a chemical analysis on it. So keep that in mind. So they say the object, don't tell them it came from the air, so they're not biased at results. Later that evening, Moore decides to kind of return to the area where the object had been found, to spend another hour and a half exploring to see if he can kind of find any other evidence and checking the areas he didn't check on his last visit. And there's 3 kind of photos of the woods and the trees here. They're even worse than the stone photos. I almost didn't include them, but I did. And during this search, he finds roughly 45 feet from where the object was a smashed and fallen dead sassafras tree, pointing generally in the direction that this object was found. So the following day, he phones the U.S. Forest Service and gets in contact with Mr. Everett H. Clocker, who's a forester, and he comes out to investigate the scene later that day and again on August 2nd. And Moore kind of comes to the conclusion after going out there to investigate with him, and he has kind of this to say about the fallen tree. It was very recently hit at a point of 21 feet and 9 inches above the ground by an object from the air, which had apparently sheared off the outer edge and broken off the butt end of the limb of a neighboring tree at a point 42 feet in the air. I surmise that the fallen tree was nearly broken in two by this object. Now, unfortunately, the expert, Mr. Clocker with the Forest Service, does not really feel the same way about the tree damage. He comes out and he says that this tree apparently has been dead for some time now, and like all such trees, had to fall sooner or later. And you can only add that evidently the tree had fallen very recently, perhaps within like the last week or two. A couple of days later, he gets a phone call on August 5th to receive an informal report from Mr. Mitchell H. Jeff McMurdy of the Constitution and Microstructure branch that had been given the stone for analysis. And he records the kind of following notes about the stone and from this phone call. He reports, the object is not a natural stone. The main part of the object is made up of silica and iron and magnesium and calcium, with equal quantities of iron and silica, which were the main things in it. The balls, quite small to something like 1/8 of an inch in the old fractured surface, made of glassy material, with some pure iron, rich in iron and silica. They are magnetic, and some were extracted with a magnet. The cement coating was principally calcium carbonate. The general opinion of the men in the Bureau of Standards to examine the object is that it's not a meteorite. It is not radioactive, and I quote, because it's important, it looks similar to slag. So Moore, actually, you might think he might be disappointed at this, that they kind of told him that his samples basically looks like slag, but actually he's kind of elated and satisfied with this result because it tells him that this object is artificial. It's not just a natural stone that he found, and it's not a meteorite, but it was constructed in some way by someone, and that it had to get there somehow. And so for Moore, the answer was obvious. One of these glowing objects flying over the Washington National sighting must have ejected this debris for some reason. Now, perhaps, it was shot off by an encounter with a jet, or perhaps it was some natural process of the way this ship works. But he was sure that the stone must have came from the sky, and because it was in the path where these objects were seen, he was convinced it must have came from one of those objects. He did not believe it came from any sort of United States domestic or foreign aircraft. And so, satisfied with these results and his preliminary inquiry into the stone, he finally decides to send his results in and get the government to further look at this. And so he forwards the sample to Project Blue Book at the Air Force for further investigation. And on August 13th, 1952, he sends this stone. He sends this 8-page report on the object's recovery. And most of the quotes that I'm including to this point come from this 8-page report letter that he wrote to Ruppelt. And he sends in this letter the forester Crocker sent on the tree fall, which is a few pages. He sent in those 3 photos of the stone and those additional 3 photos of the fallen trees. And he sent them all attention to Captain Edward Ruppelt, Blue Book's commanding officer, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio. Now, the Air Force apparently either lost or misdirected the sample or report for some time, because on December 24th, a little irritated Alvin Moore would write a 4-page handwritten letter addressed to Ruppelt again, expressing his displeasure that he has not heard anything back from the Air Force about the analysis of his stone. He reiterates that he asked the Air Force not to mutilate his sample too badly. And after they had kept it for a few months so they could compare it if there's any other UFO debris or hardware that came in so they could do a comparative analysis, that they should then send it back to him, as requested. And so he asked Ruppelt to check his files and please return the stone back to him. Now, possibly spurred into action by Moore's letter in December, at the beginning of January 1953, the Air Force would send Moore's sample to Howard C. Cross, who's in the employment of the Battelle Memorial Institute. Now, in some of the stories about this, they just kind of mention this Cross guy as like a lab tech, and they're unsure of where he works, whether he worked at Ohio State or Battelle. But it turns out Howard Cross is actually pretty infamous in UFO circles. He's a pretty interesting character. He's perhaps most well known as the author of the infamous 1953 Pentacle Memo, popularized by ufologist and conspiracy theorist Jacques Vallée, who basically, this letter was written just about a month before he analyzed the Moore sample. And Vallée basically interprets this article as that there was a cover-up, there was a secret UFO project that was going on that people didn't know about, and that they were, because they talk about a plan of like simulating UFO sightings to be able to figure out how people report them and whatnot. Only there was no cover-up. There was the secret UFO project. Well, it was sort of secret. It's the Battelle Special Report 14 statistical study they were doing. There was nothing like otherwise secret going on. So this memo got really famous by Jacques Vallée, but it's actually pretty mundane. And it's just the Battelle Institute basically begging for time to finish their analysis before the Robinson panel, which is going to be taking place a week or so after this letter was written. So all that conspiratorial sense was nonsense, but he's perhaps most famous for that letter. And he's also considered by some to be the scientist, sometimes they call him the Roswell metallurgist, because they say he was involved with analyzing the supposed memory metal from Roswell. And he was Battelle's expert on titanium. And a lot of the research that went into titanium is a component of nitinol, which is actually a memory metal, which some conspiracy theorists believe came from the Roswell crash. It didn't. But he was involved in all the development of that stuff. And so very interesting, very smart guy that was kind of downplayed in this original story. They don't mention he's Dr. Howard Cross from Battelle. And he essentially analyzes this metal. He does a cursory examination, and people, a lot of researchers get really kind of conspiratorial about this cursory examination. They basically say that's code word for they debunked it. They didn't look at it. They just put out some nonsense like after just a quick check. Like that doesn't really actually make sense. Like that's not what they mean by cursory examination. So what he did is he observed this object under transmitted and reflected polarized light. He's basically doing some spectroscopy on this object. And he submitted this brief report in a letter to the Air Force on February 4th, in which he puts a further dent into the meteoric theory, confirming the opinions of the National Bureau of Science scientist, a standard scientist, that neither the texture nor the mineralogical composition of the specimen is comparable with the texture and mineralogical composition of known stony meteorites. Cross also confirms that the sample is similar in slag as the National Bureau Standard Scientist had suggested. He elaborates, this cursory examination indicates that both texturally and mineralogically, the specimen bears a strong resemblance to very basic slag from an open hearth furnace. The elemental composition of the object contains various orthosilicates, calcium ferrite, ferrous oxide, and metallic iron. And orthosilicates are basically is a silicon molecule. It's got 4 hydrogens. It's Si4 negative. And so those tricalcium silicate, dicalcium silicate, those would be orthosilicates of like Na2 Si04 minus. Not that anybody really needs to know that. Anyways, so yeah, it's basically determined it was like common open hearth slag. So an open hearth furnace, if people don't know, is a type of industrial furnace that used to widely be used to produce steel. It's not used so much anymore, although Ukraine is one of the few countries that still, I guess, use it pretty extensively. But most people have moved on to other methods. And it's used to produce steel by burning excess carbon and other impurities out of pig iron. And how it works is the furnace is first charged with scrap metal and pig iron. It is then heated using burning gases, which melt the charge. Atmospheric oxygen and iron oxide are then added in to help oxidize that carbon, forming carbon monoxide that they're trying to remove the excess of. And then molten steel is formed as the impurities are removed. Slag forming agents like limestone, so calcium carbonates and whatnot, are added to remove the impurities, and the slag gets skimmed off, typically into these slag thimbles using these large ladles. This excess slag then gets dumped into sand pits as waste and allowed to cool. So again, silica, you might be getting that from the sand pits. And the process has largely been superseded in modern times by basic oxygen steelmaking using blast furnaces and electric arc furnaces. It's still essentially the same process. What happens is they have this vessel, and the molten steel gets formed on the bottom underneath a layer of slag. And the slag layer also kind of protects that molten steel from like oxidation and whatnot. And they tap the molten steel off the bottom and skim the slag off the top. And these furnaces, and even nowadays in the more modern ways of making steel with basic oxygen steel making, they're still using basically a furnace, only their ladle introduces oxygen through a pipe to oxygenate as they steel it, and they use things like electric arc furnaces for the heating of the vessels. But it's still essentially the same process where the molten steel comes out the bottom and they skim the slag off the top. Now, these furnaces, though, were quite popular back in the first half of the last century, even though they've been typically replaced now. And they were quite popular in Virginia as well. And it was not uncommon to actually find slag in all sorts of obscure locations. The slag ends up getting commercially used in construction and roadwork. And in this image here, you can see these slag thimbles and the kind of process, and the slag gets kind of skimmed off the top and put in these little round thimbles, which may in fact end up being 2 feet or whatever diameter they determine from the curvature of the stone, may match, where the edges of these thimbles here. And these thimbles dump it into sand pits like that, and they collect all that little rock, and they use it in road construction and other construction projects. And so you can find this stuff like all sorts of places. And I will point out, UFO researcher Michael Swartz, who I mentioned I used some of this work, he grew up, I believe, in West Virginia, and pointed out that from looking at the photos of this stone, granted, the photos are pretty bad, it looks almost identical to what he would see as a child that he would find, exploring West Virginia on the ground, pieces of slag from these open hearth furnaces. So this object basically, for all intents and purposes, was identical to what you would find from an open slag furnace. Now, Todd Zeckel, which is a researcher who wrote an article on this case, and more, they make a big deal of how the slag theory doesn't really work because the object was the result of something coming through the air, through the trees. So how could it be slag if it came from the air? Again, but the problem is they don't really have any evidence of that. It's just a belief. As we know, the trees were actually rotten and had nothing to do with the sample. The sample was found on the ground. It does not explain how it got there from the furnace, but there's no reason to believe that it came from the air. They also kind of make a lot of conspiratorial statements about how Cross had not been informed about where the object came from, and so how could he possibly, analyze it? But as I just pointed out, Moore actually told people not to say where the object came from as to not bias the results. But then he later goes on to get all conspiratorial and act like he couldn't have come to the right answer because he wasn't told. So, yeah, it's, and Zeckel also kind of goes on to say that they didn't take into consideration Moore's high caliber and status as a witness and credibility. But I'll point out the only problem with that is that Moore wasn't a witness to anything. He didn't even find the object. He's just kind of like a third-party player. So, quite frankly, his credibility doesn't have anything to do with anything in this situation. Anyways, 6 days later, on February 10th, Air Force Major Robert Brown responds to Moore's handwritten letter to Ruppelt. And he explains to Moore that his letter had gotten misrouted, and that was kind of responsible for the delay in responding to his initial report. He goes on to quote directly from Dr. Cross's February 4th report, stating, both textually and mineralogically, the specimen bears a strong resemblance to very basic slag from an open hearth furnace. The Air Force promises to return the statement within the next week, the specimen within the next week. And on February 16th, they do mail the sample back to Moore. But it's interesting because according to Moore, the sample wasn't returned until mid-next year, mid-1954. But the information we have from the Air Force implies it was mailed back on February 16th, 1953. And Zeckel would say that it was only mailed back after repeated requests from Moore to get this sample back. I think perhaps they just mean that handwritten letter that Moore wrote in December 1952. There's no evidence of any other correspondence between Moore and the Air Force regarding this sample or trying to get it back. And they responded pretty quickly saying they were mailing it back. So I think that perhaps is just a detail that's gotten wrong elsewhere. In early 1953, though, Moore, who had left the CIA, he was working at the CIA for a while, he left to return to active duty for the Korean War. And in early 1953, he retires from his active duty. He joins the Naval Reserves and was looking to go back to the CIA because I guess he had a time period in which he had to exert his right to return to the CIA, that if he didn't exert it, that he couldn't come back or something. And so he wanted to return to the CIA. But before he could do that, he wanted to take a brief sabbatical to finish this manuscript for UFO book he'd been planning to write based on those notes, his diary, basically, that he'd been keeping. And originally, this book was supposed to be titled The Space Island Menace. And he felt that after he went back to the CIA, he would never be able to get it published. It would never get through publication approval. So he was worried about that DOPSR approval, I'm telling you. But so he tried to get it published before he went back so he could sneak it in before they could tell him he couldn't put it out there. Unfortunately, he had trouble finding a publisher that kind of wanted to print his book. He spent some time in July 1953 talking to publishers. I believe he talked to like Henry Holt, like Keogh's publisher, and he talked to True. And he talked to one publisher that was most interested in publishing the book, but they were mostly a textbook publisher. And they kind of felt his book was a bit too speculative and out there, and it would hurt the credibility of the textbook publishing business. And so they kind of backed out of it. So he was unable to get anybody that wanted to publish his kind of UFO book. And I can see why, even only going through half of it is pretty wild. So he eventually scraps these plans, decides to turn to work full time at the CIA. He goes back in October and to exert his right to return to the CIA. They basically tell him they're not going to allow him to take off any more time of work once he comes back. And so you better get ready. It turns out, due to some paperwork issues, he wasn't able to return to work at the CIA until early 1954. But in 1954, Moore is employed in the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence and was back in possession of this found object that he got from the Air Force. And while working at CIA headquarters, he became friends with Captain Donald Goodspeed of the Canadian Army Intelligence, who was attached to the CIA in a liaison role. And having expressed interest in UFOs and in Moore's Virginia skystone, Moore decides to invite this guy to this Pine Moor estate on August 6, 1954, where they spend the evening discussing his UFO theories and the UFO projects of this prospective governments, the Blue Book, Project Magnet up in Canada, as well as Moore's Virginia skystone. And at this meeting, Moore presents the cylinder sample to Goodspeed to take back to Canada and have it analyzed by their project scientist. Moore felt that the Canadian project might be more open-minded than its American counterpart in its analysis. And he also gave Goodspeed a gelatinous blob that his wife had collected in their front yard. And this kind of gets into some of his later theories on sky stones and sky islands and sky chemicals that I might mention a bit later. But so the captain wraps up this material in foil so he can take it back to Canada and analyze. But by the time he opens the package in Canada, this gelatinous blob is kind of turned into this cobweb-like substance, which eventually kind of dissolves into a brown powder. Basically an angel hair kind of like case situation, almost like it kind of dissolves away. And in a letter kind of to researcher Ted Zeckel, Goodspeed would report that he believes he gave the sample directly to kind of Wilbert Smith, the former head of Canada's UFO project Magnet, for analysis. Now, we know very little of what happened to the sample when it was in Smith's or the Canadian UFO project's custody. We do know after examination by the project, and allegedly it was examined by the AVRO company, the people familiar with the Avro project, at least according to Art Lundahl, who said they were interested in the material for, I don't know, a propulsion cylinder for their project or something. And we don't really know where he gets that claim from. But according to Art Lundahl, anyways, the AVRO project was interested and they analyzed the sample. But they didn't have it very long because the sample was returned to Moore in late 1954. And, they didn't even get it from him until August 6th. So, it wouldn't have been in Canadian government custody's hands for all that long. And Captain Goodspeed, he wasn't able to return the sample personally. He had to send it back by courier, but he did send a letter on January 31st, 1955, stating that our analysis concludes that your material, this cylinder, was neither a natural stone nor a meteorite. Not really kind of telling us anything we didn't really already know. He also basically says that it has iron and silica, the principal constituents, with magnesium and calcium included as well. Tiny balls up to 1/8 inch diameter of pure iron occur in the material. A calcium carbonate cement occurs as fragmented coating on the apparently cylindrical elements of the surface. So that's basically the Canadian government's results are identical to what the National Bureau Standards kind of determined, and everyone else already kind of determined. Now, researcher Ted Zeckel reports that shortly after the object was returned by the Canadian government, Moore was approached by Dr. H. Marshall Chadwell, the CIA's director of scientific intelligence, in his office. Chadwell had heard about this mysterious cylinder stone and asked if he could borrow it for further analysis. Moore, apparently shocked after 2 years earlier being told to mind his own business when it comes to UFOs after he had proposed a UFO research project, still happily turned this project over to Chadwell. And this is actually the article by Todd Zeckel using a pseudonym, Ted Zachary, that was published in Saga's UFO Report, November 1977. And I actually scanned that myself because I own that. And about a week later, Chadwell returns the sample by messenger, not by hand, and he doesn't include any comments of the results or any sort of analysis of it. Now, Chadwell, if people aren't familiar, like I said, he was the director of the Office of Scientific Intelligence, but he was also heavily involved in the UFO topic, the Robertson panel, and tried to kind of corresponding with people like the MIT's Lincoln Group on their interest in study of the UFO topic. So he was kind of like one of the main people at the CIA kind of spearheading the UFO project. And if you recall, again, the Robertson panel took place in January of 1953. Now, supposedly after Moore gets the sample back, he puts it in his CIA office safe. 2 weeks later, Moore is supposedly going to go to the safe to get some documents out and notice the object is missing. Zeckel makes a lot of fuss about how could something possibly get stolen from the CIA, from a CIA office safe inside of the CIA headquarters, one of the most secure places in the world. And so that obviously means it was stolen by the CIA itself. Now, unfortunately, elsewhere, Moore states he doesn't actually remember if the object went missing from his office at the CIA or at his home. And just last night I found an article or a letter so Zeckel's article is basically essentially plagiarized or copied by his friend Stephen Soix and published in Fate. And Moore read that in 1978 and wrote a letter to respond to kind of provide some details in which he states that actually, I don't believe it was ever at the CIA office and it didn't go missing from the CIA office. I believe it was at my house where it went missing. Only he does believe it was stolen. Only he believed it was stolen by the men in black, aka the Skymen, that are monitoring him and spying on him, and they stole the sample from him. But that it was stolen from his home. So a great deal of the narrative about the CIA's involvement that's published in magazines is nonsense. I'll say Zeckel's article, while it has some details on that we'll address, gets most of the details on the case wrong, which is surprising considering he talked to Moore himself. So we kind of have to toss that CIA stole the piece example, but the CIA does get involved in Wilbert Smith's story here as well. And so now we get into the Wilbert Smith version of the story. And Wilbert Smith was a guy that he was a Canadian radio engineer. He had a master's in electrical engineering. He worked for the Department of Transport. And he was essentially, his job and duties involved broadcast communication standards, things like testing, like radio equipment testing standards and stuff for gear that was used, determining like the frequencies of radio and TV stations and whatnot. His job was mostly in communications and broadcasting and standards and whatnot. But he's most famous in the UFO community for his involvement in something called Project Magnet, which has been kind of hyped up as the Canadian government's kind of UFO project. But from my research, I kind of think of Wilbert Smith as Canada's Lou Elizondo. It turns out most of his project wasn't really official, didn't have official standing. It was mostly him doing it on his own or with some other people. And they even, I guess, later came out and said Project Magnet didn't even have anything to do with UFOs. It was about studying magnetic properties and fields, and that it was just Smith's hobby project that they let him do on his own time. So his actual involvement in official Canadian UFO governments is sketchy at best, but that's what he's widely kind of known for anyways. And he's also perhaps more famously known for a letter, supposedly a communication he had with Dr. Sarbecker after a broadcast conference in Washington, D.C., where Sarbecker allegedly told him, like, we have crash saucers, the security is higher than that of the atom bomb, etc. Only problem is Sarbecker, I believe, later said that if he did say that, it was basically second, third-hand rumors that he'd heard from people. Like, it wasn't actually based on anything he knew. So, again, there's a lot of Smith's pretty famous for a lot of reasons, and many of them are kind of out there and don't hold up to substantiation when you kind of look at them. But anyways, Wilbert Smith gets involved in this story, and this is how I kind of get involved in this story again, is that on February 2024, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office released the first volume of its long-awaited historical report and brought renewed attention to Wilbert Smith's claim about a piece of debris being shot off a UFO by a jet during the Washington, D.C. flap in July 1952. Smith's version of the story is very similar, as you'll see, but with an added UFO kind of element bolted on to Moore's story. And they sort of, in the panel, they say, in Frank Edwards, in a 1966 book, that a piece of a UFO was recovered near Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1952. It was shot off of a 2-foot diameter glowing disc and dislodged a 1-pound fragment. Recall, Moore's sample was close to a pound before they cut some of it off. And that 1-pound fragment was recovered by a ground team. The U.S. government had loaned this fragment to the Canadian government, and the Condon panel essentially determined that these claims are most likely false. And this story in the air report kind of got the debrief to publish a story on it, and I had done some threads on it back then as well. And so it kind of came back in the attention again. And as we can see in Smith's version, at allegedly the same time as the Moore case, and if you look like in various listings, they have them at exactly the same time, 9 p.m., July 23rd, 1952. A U.S. Navy fighter jet fires on this 2-foot diameter glowing disc, dislodging this 1-pound fragment. Smith elaborates, I was informed that the disc was glowing and it was about 2 feet in diameter. A glowing chunk flew off and the pilot saw it glowing all the way to the ground. He radioed his report and a ground party hurried to the scene. The thing was still glowing when they found it an hour later. Now, again, we don't know exactly who he was informed by about this at this point. Now, the Wilbert Smith version of the story, as the Arrow report mentions, was first brought to widespread attention by radio broadcaster Frank Edwards in his 1966 book, Flying Saucers, Serious Business, original 1966 version of the book. And in this version, and Frank Edwards' coverage, he points us to the very first mention of the story in Donald Kehoe's 1955 book, Flying Saucer Conspiracy. Now, the first thing you might notice here is that he says he gets the story from a Lieutenant Commander Frank Thompson. Now, keep that in mind because that's actually wrong. And this error would later be compounded when the Condon Project attempts to find records of a Frank Thompson and had no success. What they should have been searching for was the Lieutenant Commander Frank Thomas. Lieutenant Commander Frank Thomas was the man actually heading up the U.S. Navy's small private UFO study and was Edward Ruppelt's Navy contact during the Blue Book years. He was also the friend and source of Donald Kehoe, who he fed multiple UFO cases to that would be later published in his books. And I tried to find more information on Thomas. He's kind of hard for you to find anything about. One of the only mentions I found was a meeting between him and Ruppelt when Ruppelt was trying to go meet a Stephen Posseney, I believe about a trip that he had made to Europe that involved flying saucers. And before he met with Posseney, he decides to stop to talk to Frank Thomas about UFOs. So the name was Frank Thomas. And as we see when we look in the first mention of the story, directly quoted or referenced by Frank Edwards, and again, 1955 edition of that book as well. Donald Kehoe lists the story that contains the more basic elements of the Moore story kind of before it got distorted. Now, Kehoe reports how he received the report from Lieutenant Frank Thomas, not Thompson, as Edward later gets wrong and misspells. Kehoe states that according to Thomas, a peculiar object had fallen near Washington during the mass saucer sightings in 1952. It was retrieved by a naval officer, which we know to be now Alvin Moore. It was analyzed by the Bureau of Standards. This is the Moore story as we know it. A curious stony object was found near Washington, D.C. during the time of the sightings. It's involving a naval officer. And remember, Moore had asked people not to use his real name. He had said, if you're going to publish this story, just say, I'm a naval officer near D.C., which they did, and that he had it analyzed by the Bureau of Standards, just like the Moore story. They had difficulty identifying the object, and afterwards the object was given to W.B. Wilbert Smith at Ottawa for further analysis. So in the initial version of the story, there's not the shoot down, just that it came from the air. So where's the shoot down story come from? Because it's not in it at that point. Only the implication that it came from the air, so you might imply that it came from an object that was shot down. The shoot down story enters a little bit later. Enter Wilbert Smith and Albert Herbert Knowles. So in the March 1986 edition of Just Cause, the newsletter of Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, they were kind of a FOIA group with like Barry Greenwood and Peter Gersten, and they tried to get government UFO files out of the government and filed lawsuits. And in their newsletter, we see that Fitch had been told by a former NICAP board member, and this is Ohio ufologist C. Wesley Fitch, that Reverend Albert Baller, he was a NICAP board member, that Abner Knowles, who was also an NICAP board member, was a guest at Reverend Baller's home one evening when the topic of UFOs came up. Knowles was also a board member of NICAP, but apparently had not mentioned the UFO tale previously that he was to tell that night to Reverend Baller. Fitch took fragments of this story that Reverend Baller had related to him and then proceeded to contact Abner Knowles at his home in Elliott, Maine. We learned that at some point in early 1961, so that Albert Baller relayed this story about this UFO debris he heard from Knowles to this ufologist, C. Wesley Fitch. Fitch sent a letter to Knowles requesting further information, and he received this reply on August 27, 1961. And he says, Yes, I have a piece of the small disk in my hands. It is shown me by Wilbert Smith. At that time, 1952, Mr. Smith was heading the flying saucer research of the Canadian government and working in very close cooperation with the authorities in Washington, D.C. He is still very much interested in this matter and does independent research. The Canadian government has officially abandoned the project. To the best of my recollection, the object was shot down by a plane and seen to fall in the yard of a farmer across the river in Virginia. Upon searching the area, several pieces were found, one on which turned over to Mr. Smith for independent research. In one of his trips to see me, he brought this piece along for my inspection. It was a chunk of amorphous metal-like structure, brownish in color where it was broken, where a curved edge indicated the whole thing to have been not over 2 inches in diameter. The edge was rounded in cross-section, perhaps a quarter-inch thick, and obviously swelled to a considerable greater thickness in the center. The outer surface was smooth, but not polished, and at the broken sections there were obviously iron particles and even evidence of iron rust. I would say that the weight was roughly somewhat lighter than if solid iron, but it was not extremely light. Mr. Smith told me that the chemical test had been made of the piece at hand and that iron had been found in it, but little else could be identified. Now, size estimates of the disk seem mostly to be based on extrapolating the size of the object based on the assumption that the curvature of that broken piece came from a cylinder shape, not actual witness testimony. So it's entirely possible they got that 2 feet estimate by their measurements of the pieces, and that's why they thought the object was 2 feet that it came off of. The only problem is that this sort of mentions Knowles seeing the piece in 1952, which isn't actually possible. I can't help but think that they conflated when the event happened, not when he actually saw the piece, because as we know, Smith did not even have the piece until late 1954, and he only had it briefly. By early 1955, the piece was already back in Moore's hands. So he could not have seen that piece actually in 1952. But he did follow up again with another letter in October 1961, which he kind of sketches out the pieces he remembers being shown. And this account by Smith, relayed by Knowles, is still fairly close to the Moore story. But for the first time, we hear them explain that this piece fell on the farm after it was shot down by a UFO. And comparing the photos that we have with the drawing, I'm not sure that really helps because, again, these photos were taken supposedly before pieces were broken off, and the drawing is from memory. But I put them up there anyways. Now, one might think, I find it unbelievable that the U.S. government would give off a piece of a flying saucer if we thought it was a flying saucer, even to our closest allies like the Canadians, or that Smith would be allowed to just going around showing it to anyone, even if they are retired admirals. Now, some researchers justify this by suggesting that if there was enough pieces to go around, then they might have enough to share. That doesn't exactly make any sense to me, but at some point, probably when he sent a letter to Knowles, Fitch also directly reached out to Wilbert Smith for confirmation of this story. And in a letter on October 23rd, Smith wrote, "There was a great deal of this around, most of it in U.S. official, not U.S. Air Force hands, but there's quite a bit of it in private hands as well." Now, it's unclear, but I don't actually believe he's talking specifically about the sample that we're talking about. I think he's just referring to UFO debris in general in this situation. And he does later say, speaking on the subject of UFOs before the Illuminating Engineering Society Canada Regional Conference on January 11th, 1959, he further elaborates on UFO hardware, stating, "Various items of hardware are known to exist, but they're usually clapped into security and not available to the general public." So, Fitch, in November 1961, Fitch and another researcher, George Popovich from Akron, Ohio, are able to record a telephone interview with Wilbert Smith. And it's here that we hear for the first time the story directly from Smith. His account of the shoot down remarkably matches the version shared by Knowles, which shouldn't be surprising since he told it to Knowles. Fitch asks him, "I've been told by a mutual friend in 1952 you showed Admiral Knowles a piece of a flying saucer. Is that statement correct, sir?" Smith, "Yes, it is correct. I visited Admiral Knowles, and I had with me a piece which had been shot from a small flying saucer near Washington in that year, 1952. I showed it to the Admiral. It was a small piece of metal about twice the size of your thumb, which had been loaned to me for a very short time by your Air Force." Fitch, "What about this particular piece from the UFO near Washington? Did it differ from conventional materials? Was there anything unusual about it, sir?" Smith, Well, the story behind it is this. The pilot was chasing a glowing disc about 2 feet in diameter. Fitch: pardon me, sir, but did you say 2 feet? Smith: yes, that is correct. I was informed that the disc was glowing and that it was about 2 feet in diameter. A glowing chunk flew off and the pilot saw it glowing all the way to the ground. He radioed his report and the ground party hurried to the scene. The thing was still glowing when they found it about an hour later. The entire piece weighed about a pound. The segment that was loaned to me was about 1/3 of that. It had been sawed off. Fitch: what did the analysis show? Smith: there was iron rust. The thing was in really a matrix of magnesium orthosilicate. The matrix had a great number, thousands of these 15-micron spheres scattered through it. Fitch: you say that you had to return it. Did you return it to the Air Force, Mr. Smith? Sorry. No, not the Air Force, much higher than that. Fitch: the Central Intelligence Agency? Smith chuckles: I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I do not care to go beyond that point. I can say to you that it went into the hands of a highly classified group. You'll have to solve that problem, their identity, for yourself. And as we know, this Moore sample did end up in the hands of the CIA briefly, so that kind of matches. So in this interview, Smith describes the material in a manner approximately identical to the Moore fragment. He states that it was some piece of debris that had been cut into 3 pieces. We have 3 photos from the Bureau of Standards showing 3 pieces that we can possibly infer where he got one of those pieces. He describes it as being roughly 1 pound, like the Moore piece. More importantly, he describes it as a matrix of magnesium orthosilicate with great numbers, thousands of 15-micron spheres scattered throughout it. Recall how the Moore fragment contained mostly magnesium orthosilicates and was impregnated with microspherules, iron microspherules throughout. They're clearly talking about the same piece of debris that was analyzed. Smith, who had apparently got the story of the fragment secondhand, somehow glued on this extra element of a U.S. jet shoot down of a 2 small foot diameter disc dislodging this piece of the craft. Frank Edwards would include the Smith story and take a partial transcript from the interview he did over the telephone with Fitch and Popovich and print that in his book, Flying Saucers: Serious Business. Edwards apparently connects the original story that he had found in Kehoe's book, Flying Saucer Conspiracy, on the Moore piece. And at that point, these stories get fused together, and the relatively mundane Moore story gets forgotten, if it was ever really kind of known in the first place, because, like I say, they don't really mention his name anywhere. The Moore story really only ever gets told originally in Flying Saucers Conspiracy by Kehoe, and it's a brief story. Now, the Smith version of the story, Cylinder Fragment, reported by Edwards, along with 2 other cases of hardware, are investigated and reported on in the Condon Panel report. An Arrow report directly references the Condon Panel's work on this case, and they likely went no further than just reporting what the Condon Panel found. A lot of people give the Arrow report kind of a bad name for some of the bad information they put out. But in many cases, I believe it's just because they're just referencing the results of what the U.S. government already determined. And in this case, I don't believe they actually investigated this. They took what the Condon Project put out and reported those results in their report. Now, the shootdown event was covered in a section of the Condon report called "The Parts of UFOs or UFO Equipment" that address these alleged pieces of UFO hardware. And the report repeats basically the same story reported by Edwards and Smith. Robert Lowe, the Condon Committee project coordinator, unfortunately had kind of no luck locating any records of a shootdown event in July 1952 when he asked Blue Book. But understanding that such an event might be beyond their clearance level, they reached out to the Air Force headquarters for kind of comment on the story to see what they kind of found. And he sent this letter to them requesting information. And they receive a response directly from J.W. Clinton by direction of the Chief of Information Department of the Navy. And in this response, they indicate that they did a thorough search of all the Navy records. And again, they failed to reveal any account of a Navy jet fighter's encounter with a UFO in July 1952 or at any other time. They further state the U.S. Navy, would not be flying jets with live ammunition over Washington, D.C. area. Navy jets only carry live ammunition during firing practice conducted in restricted training ranges far out to sea. Mr. Clinton also points out Air defense and intercept functions are the function of the U.S. Air Force. The Navy operating an interceptor function that they are not equipped to provide over the Capitol would be usurping the Air Force's duty. And further, it's no surprise that they were unable to locate any matching records for Lieutenant Commander Frank Thompson, because the correct name was Frank Thomas, as originally published in Donald Keogh's 1955 book. Given the condom panel was working from Edwards' reporting of Smith's badly construed facts of the case, we perhaps cannot blame the condom panel too much for failing to find any files on this case, because the case did not actually exist. There were no files to find. But what is perhaps surprising is that there's no mention of the Moore fragment in the report, and they seemingly do not put the two cases together, which I personally find a bit odd. It would be easy to conclude that they were just not aware of the Moore sample, but this is actually not the case, because in the Condon Project files on the Moore fragment, they're actually significantly larger than the files they have on this Smith-Knowles piece. In fact, the files they have on the Smith-Knowles piece consisted of the few letters that I've already included in this slideshow. Their file on the Moore piece is actually much more significant. So they did, in fact, know all about Smith and Knowles and the Moore piece, in fact. And Moore and Lowe actually corresponded with Alvin Moore on multiple occasions about his stone and UFO theories, and they even considered kind of bringing him on as a consultant to the project, kind of briefly anyways. Lowe actually had been tipped off about the Moore story by Art Lundahl, and Art Lundahl was the founder of the National Photographic Interpretation Center, and it was basically the CIA's top photo analyst from 1953 until he retired in 1974. Lundahl would meet Moore at this Washington National Reserve meeting in 1953, and they became close friends over a shared interest in the UFO topic. Lundahl was a lifelong UFO buff who was involved in analyzing UFO photographic cases collected by the government. And Moore and Lundahl started talking about UFOs the very first time they met. And eventually, Lundahl was basically impressed with Moore's story of this found object that they had found and thought it could be something extraordinary. So at a second reserve meeting, Moore would show Lundahl a photograph of the stone. And again, these photographs are pretty bad. And Lundahl said that even though he had difficulty making any definitive judgments based on them, he said it seemed to be an alloy of some kind anyways. So 13 years later, when the Condon Project starts up and they're looking for a photo analyst, Lundahl would seem to be the kind of the ideal choice. And he did, in fact, give a briefing to Edward Condon, Robert Lowe, and David Saunders on February 20th, 1967, on the methodology of kind of analyzing photographic cases, or kind of more specifically on using photogrammetric methods and photogrammetry to in the analysis of UFO cases. But ultimately, he turned down being their photo analyst. I guess he had other things, or he didn't want to get involved in that project or whatever. But it was at this meeting that he must have shared Moore's story with the Condon Project. Because, again, if going back to that letter that Lowe wrote to Dr. Thomas Ratchford on December 8th, he mentions this. He says, Lundahl mentioned a patent lawyer in Mississippi named Al Moore, who was thought to have in his possession a report of analysis that was made of a piece of metal discovered after a fall through the atmosphere. And so Lundahl tells them about the story. Moore writes this letter in December that year saying we should follow up on this and see if we can figure anything out. So Lowe decides to get in touch with Moore by telephone, and apparently he tries to get in touch with Moore a couple of times, but Moore's phones are out. And again, Moore has some pretty crazy theories about skymen and electric wave interference messing with his phones and whatnot. But he was eventually able to get a hold of Moore by telephone on January 5th, 1968. Which caused Moore to respond with a letter that afternoon. And Moore is more than happy to support the project in any way possible, including taking time off work for fair compensation to produce a report for the project on his investigations into these skystones that he spent, since this first event in 1952, he spent the last, 16 years deep in his skystone theories and collecting this information. And he offers to write a report for them to include in their final report. And so they briefly exchange some correspondence, including Moore sends him a copy of the letters and reports that he initially mailed to Ruppelt, as Lowe had sent him a letter saying, "We are unable to find your report in the Bluebeck files." And so he sends a copy of all that information. And ultimately, they do find the files are found later in the National Archives. And the Air Force was able to find that handwritten letter as well as that correspondence of the analysis. And they had sent that on to the Air Force as well. But some Moore sends them the letter and all that details for him to check out, as well as some diary entries and whatnot. But ultimately, Lowe finds little reason to involve Moore or his story in the Condon Project's work. And in another letter to Ratchford dated January 17th, he states, "I don't think it's going to be terribly useful to follow up with Moore. If you can give me an explanation as to why we should look into the stones and they appear to have any real relation to the UFO phenomenon, then we will follow up with it." And again, some researchers like Zeckel get pretty conspiratorial about why Moore was not included in the Condon report. I think the truth is pretty simple. There is no reason to think it had anything to do with UFOs. Even if they could get a hold of that sample or the report, it was already determined to be relatively mundane slag, unconnected to any UFO event. There was no UFO sighting, nothing to really work with, no reason for the Condon Project to engage Moore with his pet theories on skystones and sky islands. And perhaps they were being generous, considering the Edward Smith story as a separate event and attempting to verify it that way. Whatever the reason, or perhaps because it was the more popular story and thus more urgent to address, the Smith version ended up in the Condon Project report, and Moore's version doesn't get published, and it mostly vanishes from the UFO literature discourse. Curiously, though, they fail to mention Wilbert Smith or Knowles in their version of events, even though they're quite prominently featured in Edwards' book that they quote. And the Condon Project files explicitly mention Knowles and Smith in the case. In some of the very few couple of letters on Knowles in the Condon Project archives, when they're talking about this case, they specifically mention Knowles and Smith. But Smith and Knowles are known for kind of their wild theories and willingness to believe just about anything, were perhaps not names that they wanted associated with the project. So by leaving those names out, it suggested that they avoided an uncomfortable situation of having to explain why they were paying any heed to cases of people that aren't very credible. And if people don't know, Knowles is actually involved with the famous a contactee called Francis Swan. Francis Swan was a contactee that lived next to Knowles. And if you've ever seen the Ebeneger movie, UFOs, It Has Begun or whatever, there's the case where Robert Friend talks about talking to the AFA and being told to look out the window and they'll see a UFO out there. That's all from Francis Swan. And Francis Swan, the contactee, made a believer out of Knowles. Knowles convinced the Office of Naval Intelligence to send a couple people to talk to Francis Swan. So all these guys are really deep into contacteeism and all this other stuff that is more kind of like the fringe side of ufology. And Knowles actually didn't live too far from Betty and Barney Hill. In fact, when he died, a lot of his books, like Adamski's books and whatnot, actually went to Betty Hill from Knowles' wife. But anyway, so there was actually, in fact, a UFO sighting that did happen in this area on July 23rd, involving some Fairfax County police officers who saw a red object hovering in the sky above Alexandria, Virginia for 10 to 15 minutes before disappearing silently to the west at a high rate of speed. Unfortunately, and you can see in the map here, Alexandria is down there to the southeast of Vienna. And this is all kind of along the path of Washington National to Dulles, where this kind of occurred. But there's no reason, again, to think that this has anything to do with the object, because firstly, there was no UFO object seen, when they found the object. It was just found on the ground. But more importantly, this fragment was collected earlier in the afternoon on the 23rd, so it could not have anything to do with this case that happened at 9 p.m. Later in the day. But Moore, believing his fragment came from the sky during the middle of a flap of sightings around the Washington, D.C. area, albeit days before the alleged event, remember they happened on the 19th and the 20th, assumed without evidence that it must have came from these glowing sky objects as were reported in the news. But there was never really any reason to think that this object came from a UFO, besides for more theorizing that the trees got damaged, and so it had to come from the air. Now, what do I believe happened? And this is a theory that I believe I share mostly with researcher Michael Swartz, is this. Moore received a sample from his employer and neighbor, Mr. Lanham. Finding it curious, he investigated the scene and eventually reported the event to the Navy and sent the sample off to the Bureau of Standards for testing. No one there found it particularly interesting, and so returned the sample to Moore. Lieutenant Commander Frank Thomas, a Navy man, convinced Moore to write up his story in a report and letter and send that off to Ruppelt and the Air Force. He also gives that report to Kehoe, as he was known to do, and Kehoe later includes that story in his 1955 book. The Air Force had little interest in the slag, having returned it to Moore, but Moore, through his work at the CIA, met a Captain Goodspeed on loan to the CIA from Canada and gave him the sample to take back to Canada, where it ended up in the hands of Wilbert Smith. Now, we cannot say for sure or how and why the shoot-down story got glued onto the Moore story by Smith, and perhaps it was added by Smith itself, embellishing inaccurate secondhand information that he received about the sample. But it may have, in fact, been received by trans-mediumship. And that may seem a little crazy and out there, but there is actually precedent. Smith, kind of despite being considered a highly credentialed scientist investigating the UFO topic, was essentially more of a contactee who believed he was talking to space people in his head, and less of a nuts and bolts guy. And this would not be the first time, in fact, that they used messages received from a medium to tell the story of a piece of alleged UFO debris. Now, in June 1960, a mysterious 3,000 piece of metal was found on the shores of the St. Lawrence River, roughly 20 miles upstream from Quebec City. And in fact, there was actually two pieces found. There was like an 800-pound piece. The 3,000-pound piece was supposedly found actually more in the river, and it was submerged a lot of the time. And the 800-pound piece was found closer to the shore, that you could see it during low tide. So it wasn't exactly on the shore. But so there's this 3,000 piece of metal, and the founder, it gets reported, and the founder of Ottawa's Flying Saucer Club has concluded that because he believes there's thousands of micrometeorites embedded in the surface, the large chunk of metal must have spent some time in space before falling to Earth. He further believes the object, metal, had been part of a large spaceship who suffered a disaster after entering our solar system. And the man, who is the man who kind of made these kind of conclusions, is none other than Wilbert Smith, former head of Canada's Project Magnet. Because of Smith's kind of status and assumed credibility, a lot of effort was put into testing these samples, and ultimately it had results somewhat similar to the Moore fragment. I mean, it was slag produced from a different kind of steel process, a high manganese steel production process. But this slag was likely produced, they determined, by the Sorel foundry, located 50, someplace say 100 miles upstream. And so where do they get this story about the spaceship and it being part of a large ship that came into our solar system? Well, they get it from a medium. And kind of despite strong kind of evidence of the terrestrial nature of the slag, which Smith even ends up admitting is likely explanation, both kind of him and this group continue to proffer up this fantastical story that they obtained through a trance mediumship. So kind of knowing this, we cannot really rule out that's where he kind of obtained the story of a jet shooting at a glowing disc. It's also possible that it's just kind of a natural assumption. Kind of Moore almost gets there because he believes it came from a UFO that was flying over the area that kind of fell off the radar. And so I guess it's not too far of a stretch to think that means it came off a UFO that must have got shot or damaged somehow. However, the story kind of gets added, whether it was through mediumship like we know he did in the past, or him just kind of extrapolating out, embellishing the details on his own, it eventually comes to the attention of Ohio UFO investigators C. Wesley Fitch and George Popovich, who tracked down Knowles and then Smith to get their version of events. Frank Edwards ends up taking the story from Kehoe's book, combining it with the story told by Fitch and Popovich in 1961, and then he publishes that in his 1966 book. The rest is basically history, and people have spent decades investigating the case has kind of become so distorted from the original facts that it's no wonder no one's kind of ever been able to come to any kind of confirmation or conclusion. So kind of unfortunately, there really was not a shoot down event, and there's no reason to believe one ever happened. There was not even a UFO sighting associated with this metal fragment. However, I think there can be little doubt that the Smith and Moore fragments are the same fragments. We know that Smith received the Moore sample taken back to him from Canada by Captain Goodspeed, along with the gelatinous bob that turned into an angel hair-like substance. The description, the makeup of the alleged fragments match almost identically. The story and the people involved match up almost identically. The only difference really is this glued-on aspect of how the object came to end up in this rural farm in Virginia. And that's something we'll likely never know. How does a piece of furnace leg end up in a forest in rural Virginia? But I mean, I doubt it was a UFO that put it there. And it's to believe that these were different cases, you would have to believe that Smith simultaneously received two samples from an event that happened at the same time. So two UFOs were shot down or something at the same time, and he got two samples from the same place, but they're different. But Smith never mentions the second sample. He only mentions the one sample. I mean, I think it stretches credibility to believe that they could be different cases. And I think a lot of researchers have kind of opened up and decided that they are in fact the same sample and fragment. And I just want to kind of close with a couple of other details about Moore. And like I said, Moore is a very interesting guy. This whole thing started off his jump into the UFO topic. He ultimately would get his book published in 1979 by Greg Barker's Cesarian Press under the title Mysteries of the Skyman. And again, like I mentioned, that would be republished again in 1977 by Timothy Becker. And in this book, he kind of expounds his theories that are not too different than Charles Fort, actually. He kind of believed that there's these sky islands floating above, and that's where these stones come from. And there's these sky men, and these sky men were mostly good, but they were also, there was a nefarious bunch of them, the kind of the demon bunch, the kind of the Darrows, and they were involved in all sorts of nefarious activity, like, draining blood from animals and murdering people and all sorts of stuff. And in this book, over these preceding years, like, he basically ends up collecting well over 1,000 stones that he believes are from these sky islands. And I'm not exaggerating here. Almost every time this guy finds a rock on the ground, he thinks it's a skystone. If he finds a piece of trash on the ground in the book, he thinks it's a sky chemical. It's from the sky chemicals from the sky islands. If he finds a line scratched into concrete, he thinks it's from the skymen. So he spends this whole book basically talking about how he's collected thousands of these like pieces of trash and stones and debris that he believes are coming from these sky islands, and that these skymen are spying on him and other people. And it's a pretty out there kind of book. So I would take it with kind of a grain of salt, and it's kind of no wonder why people didn't really want to kind of associate with him with the projects. In fact, James McDonald would call him about this case in May of 1970, and after and again, he's staying in Mississippi, I believe, at the time, and he calls him from a firehouse. And Moore believes this is because McDonald's is paranoid about the skymen spying on him, and so he wasn't calling from his hotel, and to avoid being bugged by the skymen. But he eventually talks to him, and it wasn't bugged like the time he talked to Lowe on the phone. The phone call was clear, but McDonald doesn't come out with a very good impression of him. He writes a letter right after this to Dick Hall at NICAP, basically stating how Moore is a nut job. He believes in hollow earth and all these other crazy theories, and he's just extremely out there, and he shouldn't be taken seriously, basically. So he's a guy that, if he were to come out today, has some of the most impressive background I've ever seen any so-called UFO people have. I mean, an amazing credentialed background in history, but he was essentially kind of really out there with his theories. And his theory as to why Smith had the wrong story was that it was a CIA or Air Force cover-up of the real facts of how he found the 1 pound skystone. I don't exactly follow his logic there, because how is creating a story about a jet fighter shooting something down a better cover-up than him finding a stone in the forest that has nothing to do with an event? But that was his theory, that somehow Smith got a bogus story fed to him that was potentially part of a cover-up. But he basically widely recognizes that Smith had his piece of the fragment. So, and this story was, again, briefly mentioned in a distorted version. It shows up in a Project Blue Book status report number 10, where they tell a similar story, only they say it happened on September 12th, where he finds a stone sample and it's sent into Blue Book, and they basically determine it's just common slag from an open hearth furnace. And I'm not sure how they get the details wrong here. This was published shortly after the Cross letter where he analyzed it. So perhaps they're just, sometimes they get the dates wrong because they're looking at the date on a letter or a report, not the date it actually happened. But the story does make kind of a brief mention there as well. Last thing I just end real quick is these are just a couple of patents of his for his airship that he had. And it was a weird airship that didn't fly. It didn't land or do anything horizontally. It always was kind of facing up at an angle, and it would land on its rear end like that and take off from its rear end. And of course, he never built these, but this is just one of his many patents. A lot of his patents have to do with boats and floats and cars that can roll without damage and other kind of weird stuff. But is a very interesting guy. If people don't agree with me that it's pretty clear that the samples are the same and it's the same story, if I didn't explain that well enough that some people come out of this and they don't understand and they don't agree with me, please let me know in the comments, and I'll see if I can address what didn't make sense. Because I think at this point it's quite clear it's the same story, it's the same case. It's just Smith bolted on a shoot down story that didn't actually happen to it. And that's that. Thank you for sticking in there for that long presentation. I think I did it in less than an hour and a half. All right. Back to you, Rachel.